It's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Lina Echeverría. Is that right?
Echeverría.
There we go. I'm not going to go through the typical introduction stuff because Lina's going to tell us about the pathway of her career and how it brought her to where she is today. So we're going to hear a lot of those details. But we have a special honor. She is our first Roberta Rudnick speaker. So we have the Roberta Rudnick Fund Colloquium series that has helped Lina come here to talk to us about her career path. And so this is the inaugural one. So actually, we want to give a shout out and thank you to Roberta for helping to fund this. So. Okay, so without further ado, I want to give Lina the full time to talk to us about her career and how she got to where she is today. So let's give a very warm welcome to Lina Echeverría.
Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful to have you all here. I've been talking to some of you, and it's been a lot of fun. Part of it has been a trip back memory lane that has made me nostalgic for where I had two different paths in my career, and I took the one that it took me away from my very much enjoyed previous life. For those of you who want to hear a talk in science, that one is upstairs. Those of you who want to hear a motivational speaker, I think that's on the other side. Those of you who want to hear stories about my life, you're here. And I have to be honest, it's kind of weird to give a talk where you're talking about this is what I did and this was my life experience and whatnot, but this is exactly what Nick and Rich asked me to do. And I will share it with you in a very candid way, telling stories about how I experienced the path that life put in front of me, and telling some stories probably out of line about some of the people that I shared the path with. My education in geology was a very traditional one. I started at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia and I did my undergraduate there. The untraditional part of that piece was that when I applied to enter into geology, they did not allow any women. 1973 I graduated, so I applied to enter earlier on in '68. And careers down there are 5 years, not 4. And I had to make a presentation to the Board of Deans and make my case. And one of the questions they asked me is, so what would your dad say? Just to give you women a flavor of the way it used to be, we have come a long way, babies. From there, this was the beginning, or not the beginning, the middle of the plate tectonics revolution, and it was really exciting time. And I decided that there was a lot more to learn, and I wanted to come to this country. So I went to Stanford, which was a wonderful place because that's where everything was happening. The magnetic striping was being identified by Alan Cox in the mid-Atlantic ridges and explaining, the movement of plates. And Gary Ernst was doing blue schist metamorphism, and Bob Coleman was doing ophiolite. So it was a very exciting time. And I started working on my PhD on some weird rocks. I would be going on to work on weird rocks later on. These were gabbros that intruded the Franciscan complex, the accretionary prism, prior to blue schist metamorphism. So their generation was kind of a strange thing. And so my career journey started very typical. I had done a little stint in a consulting firm right after undergrad. I was a TA and an RA at Stanford, and from there I came to Washington. And what I was going to do in Washington was to continue the geochemistry of those weird gabbros, but instead, while at Stanford, I had heard a talk from Nick Arndt talking about komatiites, which had just been discovered in Archean terrains. And I sat there and I said, wasn't there somebody who published something in 1952 about high high magnesium lavas in Colombia. As you can tell, I really didn't know what I was talking about. But I really was inspired to follow that, and I was able to convince Al Hoffman at DTM that to let me pursue that. And he gave me the space, okay? I will be talking later about giving people the space. And he gave me the space, and so I went on to indeed find and document the first occurrence of non-Archean komatiites. Fresh komatiites, these were very exciting rocks. I could really see my career continuing to work on that. And then we went on to the Max Planck. Al Hoffman was made the director of the Institute for Chemistry there in Mainz, and we went on to work there. So it was very easy for me to visualize a very straightforward career. From Stanford, I had gone to DTM, and then I was going to the Max Planck. Now, while at DTM, Corning Incorporated, a company of the only thing I knew was Corningware, and probably all of your parents knew about Corningware back then. Most of you young people probably don't know what that is, nor have cooked in their casseroles, but they were starting to look for geologists. Geologists, like all of you know, we are used to dealing with data sets that are incomplete. We don't have all of the data points, so we make inferences. We can think in terms of models that do not rely on 100% points. And Corning, throughout the years, had learned that they were better than material scientists who were used to two-component systems, magnesium and silica, perhaps, or alumina. So they came after my husband. My husband had been the trailing spouse. And I'm using the terms for you ladies or men who are in careers and are going to face or have faced this. He was a trailing spouse when we moved from Stanford to DTM. And he was a trailing spouse when we moved from DTM to Max Planck. So here we were, having accepted the positions in Max Planck. And when Corning came and offered him a position, he was an experimental petrologist, and they wanted an experimental petrologist. And then they would be willing to open up an opportunity for me. So I thought, piece of pie. We go to Germany, we enjoy our years there, and we have a landing pad when we come, and we live there for a short period of time, and then on we go, and I continue with my career in research. Very nice, easy path, straightforward. If you read the abstract, life is what happens when you're busy making plans. And my career looked more like this. Ching, 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 boom. And I was not prepared for it. So the career path that I followed, and I will come back into detail, and we're going to explore how each one of these zigzags took place and what it felt like, because I'm going to be talking about what it feels like. I think it is important to understand what it feels like in life and in science. So my career journey started doing research, moving on, yes, to marketing, and coming back and managing and then leading larger groups all the way up to leading the European Technology Center and being the vice president in science and technology. Could I have imagined that life at all at any point before? No way, Jose. My original plan when I came to this country was to do a master's degree and to be back in Colombia 2 years later. After my first year, Stanford said, "You look like you are PhD material, and we want to offer you support." And I said, "Sure, why not?" I didn't really know what I was getting into, but it sounded really exciting. So I'm going to now start telling you the stories of how this happened and what it felt like. But the overarching piece is there's no way today where you are as graduate students, and even as faculty, you never know what door the life is going to open, sweet or bitter. But there's no way that you can design your careers based on your present knowledge. But there's a huge opportunity if you allow yourself to explore the doors that open. Quite often we knock on that wall because that's the one we've been facing all the time when the door is behind us. So it's very easy for me to say that now. Steve Jobs used to say you can only connect the dots of life in hindsight. And it is true. But trust me, or trust yourselves better than trust me. So I was doing research in, as I said, these Gorgona komatiites. It was really exciting. My level of energy was really, really high. I don't know if some of you may know, those that have been doing komatiites. Gorgona it no longer is, Colombia's tightest security prison. Angel Island, right? All surrounded by shark-infested waters, full of snakes. The Gorgons were the mythological creatures with snakes for their hair. Pizarro, one of the explorers, the Spanish explorers, landed in that beautiful tropical island to give a rest to his crew, only to have 2/3 of them die to poisonous snakes. So everything about Gorgona was a wonderful experience. The field guide that was assigned to me was one of the highest dangerous, most dangerous prisoners. Why? Because he could really be very comfortable in the tropical rainforest, having been in prison because of something he did while in the guerrillas. And to protect me, I was given this teeny little guide, probably 15 years old, with a rifle. So that's what we did. So it was a very exciting time. And many of you, particularly those doing geochemistry, said, why did you ever live that life away? Why did you move away from it? And honestly, I can only say, I didn't know I was doing it. My plan was to be in Corning for a couple of years and to move on, back to research. But remember, I owed my husband one. I owed him two. He had followed me twice, and it was my turn to follow him. So this one is for the geologists and the geochemists. This was the cover page of the Geology magazine. It doesn't, a publication that doesn't exist anymore, when the discovery was made. And this was one of my photomicrographs that appeared on that. So how do you move from the geochemistry of komatiites to glass research? How do you move in terms of research, and how do you move in terms of your emotions and your psyche? So first of all, let's understand what Corning is. And this is not paid political advertising. This is just to give you a little bit of background. Corning Incorporated is a older than 165 years old company that started as a simple glass company that throughout the years has really invested in research. 10% of its revenues are usually, or 10 or 8, or but around those lines, sustained through time, and has had a long-term vision, thinking that they need research. It's headquartered in Corning, New York, the Finger Lakes region. It has about 40,000 employees. The centralized R&D is in Corning, and this is where we moved to. But to really understand Corning, you need to see what kind of technology it has been involved in throughout the years. The track record is such that you can no longer put it on a line, so you have to go up and down. So zigzag with me a little bit. It started making signal lenses for railroads. And when Thomas Edison made the invention of the light bulb, it needed an envelope that would sustain the vacuum and allow the filament not to be burned. And they came to Corning. And Corning started making them one by one and ended up inventing the machine that would allow them to be made by the millions. Once it became a commodity issue, Corning sold it. And that's the history of the corporation. So later on it invented Pyrex, heat-resistant glasses, silicones, Take a look at 1934 vapor deposition process. This is one of the examples that Corning uses to say we believe in long-term research. It sat on the bench without any application for 30 years. It was capable of making the purest glass composition silica, but nobody needed it. The market was not ready for it until the British Telecom came up with the idea of optical fibers, but there was no way of making it. Corning resurrected vapor deposition processes, and the rest is a different story. So first it light up the world, later it connected the world through optical fiber. Picture television processes were a result of the invention for radar that it did for the army, and then an expansion of that to black and white and color TV. The fusion overflow process, 1964, was a process that was invented to make windshields for the auto industry, but it was much too expensive, so again, it was shielded. Until in the 1980s, my group, and I'm very proud of this one, came up with compositions that enable all of the explosion of video equipment that now is so ubiquitous in our lives. From flat screen TVs to cell phones to whatever, those are Corning, and so on and so forth. Chemical substrates for catalytic converters. So Corning relied on very fundamental research and allowed its scientists the freedom to do very high-level fundamental understanding. That was the reason it was so interesting, particularly for my husband, who was an experimental petrologist, and I was willing to give it a shot. So we were offered opportunities in glass, but when I arrived, I realized that I had been assigned to ceramics research. Ceramics research, I started doing, I don't know if this means anything, colloidal suspension, salt gel suspension, and making them into bodies to be sintered to try to address compositions that were very difficult to find, to deliver otherwise. Honestly, I couldn't care less about colloidal suspensions, but I worked at it for a couple of years. And a little later, I was assigned, so you see there, research and development. I was talking to somebody. Research is where the fundamental understanding is done. Once that fundamental understanding, there's an application that is found, it's moved to development, and from development, it will go to manufacturing. I was asked to help solve an issue that Corning was having with its diesel particulate filters. Diesel particulate filters had been a very successful business for Corning. It is, and now with all of the EPA regulations and whatever, it has grown tenfold. These are Cordierite bodies through which the exhaust of diesel engines flows through, and then alternate sides of the channel are plugged in, so the flow is forced through the walls, and the particulates that would otherwise make soot and make air unbreathable are trapped. In order to eliminate them, they're cycled through very high temperatures. So they need to have a very high thermal shock resistance, and they need to have very good mechanical properties, because they're put inside cars, vehicles that are juggling up and down all the time. And they reached a point where they could no longer maintain the two properties at the same time. So then they asked me to come and help. And I said, sure, Cordierite grows in metamorphic rocks. I can help. And I did. And I started looking at them. The theory of the group of scientists that had developed this, and for 15 years, was that the crystals were aligned. And the Cordierite has different expansion according to crystallographic orientation. So it was this alignment that allowed them to take advantage of the minimum thermal shock resistance. And that they were losing that, and they were losing the mechanical properties. And I started looking at them with very traditional geological tools, thin sections. And after thin sections, they're very fine-grained, I went to TEM. And I started looking at thin sections, and I said, you know, these things are reminiscent of spherulites. So spherulites grow when there are very few nucleation points for all of the material that needs to be crystallized. So all of these crystals need to share the same nucleation point, essentially. So they're radial, and they impinge with each other. And then I found that this is a TEM. Now, this is one spherulite coming from this side here with a center somewhere here, and this is another one. I found that right at the intersection of spherulites, there were cracks. And I reasoned, the bigger the spherulite, the bigger these cracks are going to be, the lower your mechanical resistance. And then I said, so if I reduce the size of the spherulites by adding more nucleation sites, these little cracks are not going to be as damaging. I was on a roll. Sure enough, I was being able to prove it and this and that. But what do you think of a scientist that comes on 90 degrees in orientation relative to the theory that has prevailed and been successful for the last 15 years? Not very popular. Pushback, resistance, and that's what I encountered. I would not be allowed to make presentations to upper management. I could not make experiments in the large scale in the manufacturing facility. I was considered, the black sheep. For 2 years, I fought it. I would plead with my manager, please, I am not telling you to tell them I'm right. Just give me the floor. It was awful, to no avail. Then I decided what any other scientist with a little bit of chutzpah would say, I'm out of here. My husband can stay, I'm out of here. And I started looking for jobs. DTM, my alma mater, had an opening. Those only happen when one of the scientists dies. And I applied. 90 people applied. Top 3 candidates. Lina Echeverría is among them. Boy, I was on a roll. She didn't get it. For the ladies of the house, 30 years later, I found out the reason. The scientists reasoned, and if anybody is familiar with the DTM, as happy as I was and as wonderful as it was full of old men, white men. And they reasoned that my husband was very nicely employed, my children were established in their schools, they were little kids, and why disturb the family peace? They never gave me the option to have a say in my life. In retrospect, life was closing a door. So I kept looking for jobs. I applied to industry. And one of the directors of glass figured it out. And he said, we're not going to lose one, but we're going to lose 2. So Lina, I'm opening an opportunity for you in glass ceramics research. That was closer to home anyhow. I retrenched. One of the directors of the lab said, she has had her nose bloodied, and that's exactly what it felt. And I hated it. It was the darkest moment in my career, having come from the high level of excitement of my komatiites to this. It was a very painful moment. But I learned it was a huge understanding. And if I'm taking too long and you walk out of here before I finish, I will later tell you why it was such a big understanding, but it was a very painful moment. So I started doing research in glass ceramics. Glass ceramics is one of the families that Corning had invented. And what you do with glass ceramics is you decide the composition, you define the composition of a glass so that once you form it and you start cooling it down, these little crystals start growing. And they serve as nucleation sites for a phase whose composition you have figured out based on the properties that you want as you later on reheat the substrate. So you end up with a ceramic that doesn't have porosity. Every other ceramic that you start by making powders or whatever has porosity. And the aim of most material scientists is to eliminate porosity. But here you have residual glass but no pores. And the properties of the materials vary according to the composition. For very high thermal shock resistance, the Corning ware that I was talking about, you use beta spodumene, which has also been used in more sophisticated applications like space shuttle windows and retainers. If you add some mica to the composition, you can vary the particle size and you can make materials that are actually machinable. Really, this is really interesting. The system that I started working on was lithium disilicate. And for that, you had to figure out the right color. These were self-glazing so that they have this shiny aspect when you ceramic them for dental applications. And if any of you has had an Ivoclar bridge put in your mouth, then you can say you have one of my inventions in your mouth. So I did that, and it brought life back to me. I was among the scientists that were the geologists who had really understood my theory on spherulites, who had really sided with me. The lab, by the way, split pro-spherulites against spherulites. It was more like pro-Lina against Lina, but so at this point, I had regained that interest. I had been given the space. I had been given the opportunity when I was offered to be moved from ceramics to research. I was offered to work with one of the highest ranking scientists, which was a little feather in my cap. And he was just a wonderful, mature, evolved soul. And he gave me the space, and he just brought back my self-respect, which I had somehow along the lines lost there. So I did that. And as part of that, I started going to the consumer products, where Corningware and those were made, and talking to the marketing people and showing them samples. Hey, look, we could do this. Look, how about that? And at one point, the vice president of sales and marketing for consumer products said, you know, consumer is coming down. We have too many Chinese imports. Dinnerware was being sold, at a bargain price. Consumer just couldn't quite make it. So for the second time, the first one I got my nose blotted, but the expectation was that here I wouldn't. I was asked to solve an issue. And they said, I want somebody that can have a completely new perspective, that can do things completely different. And I think you can. So I took on the job. Marketing manager for Corningware. How's that for a geologist? I remember going to his office the first day that I started, and I said, okay, so are you going to send me to a little marketing course or something? I really don't know what I'm doing. He says, we don't have the time. This is going to be baptism by fire. So we did. So then I learned about focus group and what does the market want. I, of course, knew the technology very well. So when the market said, I need this, I could say, okay, we can make it this way and so forth. I ended up leading a very large and complex project. Lesson number 2 for me. Very large, complex project where we moved the largest effort that the consumer products had done in the last 20 years in the shortest period of time. In 11 months, we went from concept to putting it out on the market. And every single customer, I learned to deal with Walmart, with Kohl's, with Sears, you name it. Every single one of those clients took the product, which 100% distribution. I'm telling you things that I had to learn along the way, but it was very exciting. So what we launched was really the last hurrah for consumer products. A few years after that, Corning sold consumer products, and consumer products was no more. So we started, as I say, from marketing, the idea, understanding what people wanting, talking to manufacturing, talking to the researchers, and we launched a full-fledged line, and it was really, really exciting. I had learned something completely new. And it was just so different. I remember working with the ad agency, doing print. This is a print campaign, but we were also doing TV campaigns. It was really exciting. Most people that leave the lab in Corning and go to a commercial job don't come back to the lab. Because once you have had that responsibility and you have millions of dollars in budget to control, and it kind of starts becoming addictive. So I decided I better take stock of my life. What do I want to do now? I've tried several different roles. Where do I want to go? I realized that my roles had evolved. I had gone to the technical ladder, to commercial ladder, not to manufacturing. So I could offer many different things that I could not have offered when I was still just in the technical ladder. It's considered, very impressive to make it in the commercial side when you come out of the technical side, but I wasn't the first one to do it. Many people had done it very well. And then I said, what do I want to do? And can I have my career my way? Can I start playing an active role? Because up to that point, I had had a very dark moment, and I had had some doors opening, but I hadn't been directive in what I want to do. And I said, okay, what have I learned? First of all, and some of you have heard me say this, every career is unique. So I didn't have to take any lessons from those that had left the lab and had stayed out. I thought it was very important not to let my position define who I was. I was not any better or any worse because I had already 2 different experiences. For me, it was always very important to be able to balance my life. At this point, my children were around 10 or 11, perhaps a little older, 12 or 14. And going into those teenage years, and I wanted to have the energy and the time to give them. But I understood that whatever you do, the rule number 1 is performance, performance, performance. You better be excellent at whatever it is that you're doing. Not try to be perfect, but deliver the best without the agony of the perfect. Perfection is always the benefit of good enough or excellent. There is no such thing as a job description. You define what it is that you want to do and how you want to do it. So that was one learning, because what I had done in consumer was not done in very traditional ways. In that I pushed the group so fast to do something that nobody thought possible, but I realized that if we didn't, we would go under, that we managed the unthinkable. And I started realizing that, you can be an asset for whatever organization you are. Remember, you don't owe the organization. Obviously, there's always a trust and a behavior that you owe, but the organization also has invested in you, and you're an asset to them. So that was the key. The other piece that I learned was relative to myself. The most important thing was to be true to myself. So I did not regret having had my nose blooded, because I had been honest about what I saw in science. I needed to follow my heart, and I would do that always. Do what you love. If at one point you don't know exactly where you want to go, just the one that really, that feels so good, right? Follow your inner drive. And the arena is the world, means you can find space to play in many a place within the confines or beyond the confines of an organization. In consumer particularly, because coming from the technical side, you're very rational. You're really trying to respond to data, and you must. And in consumer, there was that intuitive side. the colors, the displays, the things. So I had enjoyed using both sides of my brain, and I said there's no reason why I should stop doing that. And the very important one is stay in the moment. Don't plan your life for the rest of the 30 years you have left, or 50 or 80. Just enjoy today. So with those, when I was wondering whether to stay in commercial or return to the lab, I had two opportunities. I had another opportunity to do marketing for the technical side of Corning, not the consumer products, or to come back to the lab. And to come back to the lab, I was offered the position to be the manager of the glass ceramics research group. That's the group that I had left when I went to consumer, which was really tempting, but honestly, at the same time, rather scary, because seldom does one of the peers, at least in corporate America, immediately become the boss. And I knew that they were all going to be looking at me very, very carefully. But that's what I did. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna run the glass research group. This position here, manager glass ceramic research, and I didn't give it a thought. I didn't think, okay, where is this going to lead me? Could I go? How high could I go? Because that would have frozen me. I never would have imagined that it would have led me all the way to core technology director, research director, and then division vice president and vice president, whatever. I'm not here trying to show credentials. I'm just trying to give you an idea of a thought process. Again, it's not about planning your whole life ahead. It was just about the next step. And my next step started with one-on-one meetings with every single one of the scientists that was going to report to me, who were really skeptical and harsh, and nobody wants managers. Who does want to be controlled? I presume none of you do. And for many people in scientific and technical backgrounds, having a manager equates to being controlled. And that's what I heard many times. So as I talked to them, and as I realized from my bosses, I understood that what I was going to be doing was not managing, but really to be responsible for innovation. For how do you identify and make happen the breakthroughs that are going to make a difference to the world? And of course, the corporation is about making money. You cannot deny that, right? And it's an urgent challenge, but it's really, really very difficult to do it. But it's not about processes. As I talked to the scientists there, I realized it's really a social process. It's really, it's about becoming the orchestra director that makes sure that every instrument comes in on time at the right moment and makes music. So as I say, it was a daunting process. But I kept thinking, okay, just here, just for today. And I started realizing that when corporations, and now I'm going to be giving you a little story about corporations versus academia. When corporations take innovation seriously, as Corning does, sometimes they make one of the biggest mistakes in the world in their attempts at imposing a culture of innovation. They start by defining a strategy. This is our destiny. Okay? And in order to accomplish that strategy, we have to have innovation. And they do a process that is called re-engineering. And then they say, you will innovate, you're going to have, they put processes and techniques, and you're going to have ideation meetings on Tuesdays afternoon. And that's when you're going to come up with your best ideas. And then every project is going to be reviewed every 6 months. And then we're going to decide which one gets the money. And they just start putting intentionally, if you cannot read it, that's the intention, the practitioners become little chess pieces that are replaceable. And when I started talking to the people in glass research, they were really, really frustrated because they had just delivered a new material for magnetic memory disks. Most of you probably don't know that memory disks used to be little floppy disks like this that we used to carry. Like, now we carry memory sticks, right? And so they had come up with this wonderful invention of magnetic memory disks that were able to have a density of data that was unheard of. And the customer was there ready, and the manufacturing process had been designed, and this was all done in the group that I was becoming responsible for. And all of a sudden, project killed. Why? The scientist asks. They were not important enough to be given a reason or to participate in the system in the decision-making system. So it was a huge lesson for me, and the more I talked to them, I really discovered or rediscovered that people do matter, and that creativity comes from within. And that is not just in corporate America. That's in your everyday. When you follow that little sign of, that little feeling of, I want to do this. I really think the next experiment is, that's that creativity that drives you from within. And to have true innovation, you need people dreaming, people tinkering, people making little things just for the fun of it. Yes, even in a corporation that spends money that the shareholders consider very important. So I started playing, and I don't mean playing in a responsible way, but in a way of myself finding my own wings, with how do you create these cultures where innovation is really fun. And I started understanding that beyond all of these processes and techniques that are given to us, innovation comes from cultures that impassion, that free people up to explore, to take risks, to just make things happen. To go from being right in the middle of the bottom of the earth, in the nucleus, that can come up all the way to the surface. And how do you do that? Well, earlier in my career in leadership, I only had a group of 27 people. The lab had several thousands. So I decided that I could only affect my group. I would do it only in my group, myself as an individual leader. I would have to have the support of top leadership because I was going to be doing things differently. And what do I mean by that? Rather than simply following the prescribed period reports every so often and reviews and this and that, I was going to give a lot of freedom. So I had to have support from top leadership. And the interaction between different groups would allow it to go to different organizations. So whom was I talking to that we were talking about the balancing of forces? So I understood that we had to have forces balancing between expansive forces and rigor. Because after all, you're doing science. And you have to maintain the rigor of the scientific process. Otherwise, what you're going to deliver is going to be a piece of junk. So creative forces, that includes the creative drive, the conflict that had not been managed when I was the contrarian, right? The freedom to think differently, the respect, you have to balance those with very clearly defined roles, with an organization structure that says very clearly who does what with whom, and you have to have programs that you're going to follow. So as you start putting this together, what you do, and I will give you a sense of my experience when I came into the group today here. You start seeing, when you walk into a group, you can really understand if it is a group that allows people to think differently or not. Simply by talking to people. If everybody gives you the same spiel, that's not an organization that allows you to have conflict. Is it an organization where the quirkiness of each person is celebrated? The origins, the ethnicity, the gender orientation are embraced, are celebrated, or not? Is it an organization where people just say, oh, it's good enough? Or do they really drive and strive for excellence? Do they know what the leader stands for? If it is, then you have a culture that is well defined and you know what it feels like. If it isn't, you also do, but you see that it's a very different kind of culture. But that culture alone, that freewheeling culture alone, startup, is not always good enough. So you need to structure a clear organization. Who's responsible for timelines? Who's responsible for creating new ideas? Who's responsible for moving them down the path? So I'll give you little examples of what I mean. Embracing creative conflict. What are examples of conflict? Has anybody has anybody experienced conflict in their research or in their groups? Can you just give the nature of the conflict? What was in conflict with what?
With the project conclusions, who's responsible for deciding if the paper is going to be published where, and if the idea is, they agree with the idea. That's going to be in the content
Ownership of
ownership of idea, exactly.
It's one of the biggest ones in science because we identify so much with it's a huge one. Anybody has another example? Has anybody met the person that always has the right answers? Or have you not met such a thing? Who's always right and who is so forceful in letting you know that nobody can talk against? Is that a source of conflict? Has anybody been shy enough to speak up in a new group because of fear of what somebody might respond? Those are all pieces of conflict. Has anybody encountered a person whose results somehow always depend on somebody else's? Those are all reasons not to want to interact with those people, right? Those are reasons why people don't want to create teams, right? And if today those seem trivial, because at this stage in your lives, your results really depend largely on yourselves. But that will not always be that way, and the innovations nowadays are much harder than they were 100 years ago, so you really have to work on teams. But these are reasons why, or has anybody felt, as I felt, that you were not even given the opportunity to come up with your own different results? If you, as a group leader, don't have the guts, because it takes guts, we are all raised, oh, you be a good boy, good girl. No, just don't fight. No, just be sweet. It's a very strong imprint that we get from day one, not to disagree. Disagreement is good. Disagreeing respectfully, giving the space to others is important. Being able to manage that disagreement, to jump to the fire and to say, yes, you are right, and yes, you have a point, but you know what, you're not going to kill each other, so let's talk about it. That's what embracing creative conflict is all about. I had a scientist, all of this that I have told you, the guy who knew it all, was one of my scientists. The guy whose results depended on the results of others, he would sniff them and then he would put them together and then he would present them as an invention disclosure. Those are real people. I'm not making this up. And then I had a scientist who really didn't dare speak up much. He was a small, petite woman and very, very quiet, and she had really good ideas, and on one-on-ones, she was really forceful to me, but she wouldn't dare talk. Why? Because there was always the gorilla who knew everything and who thought she was an idiot, right? So we had to work with him on becoming aware of what a strong, forceful, and negative personality he was, and then we had to work with her on becoming more forceful. You know how we did that? We enrolled her in karate. Yes! And little by little, her demeanor changed. You know, and she started becoming, and the other one started quieting down. So that's what I mean by creative conflict. Liberating creatives to take flight. It's about creating the space where anybody can flourish. One of the fundamental physicists that came to my group had been in a little corner doing ab initio calculations for years. And he was off to himself, a really bright guy, off to himself, never interacting. And I started talking to him, and in talking to him, I realized that he was an exquisite ballroom dancer. He could really take to the floor and put on the show. And I said, and you've never talked to us about that? Well, no, not really. When I come in here, I'm the professional. And I don't know. When you come in here, I want to be the total human being. I want all of you. And he started talking about it. And he started giving lessons, not in the lab, but outside. And then he started coming in, with, again, his whole being behind his thoughts. Okay? Or the guy who made wonderful truffles. The guy who made wonderful truffles used to give them to everybody in the lab. He was also the one that would sniff everybody's results and then present them on his own. So they come with both sides. And then I started talking to somebody whom I couldn't quite read. She was an electrical engineer, and she was really very smart. And this, remember, this is in 1995 or something like that. And I couldn't quite read her gender inclination. She used to wear blazers and shirts, and her hair was very cropped. But I was not going to ask her, are you a lesbian? So I would just talk to her, and I started saying, do you have a family? Do you live by yourself? And little by little, she started talking about how difficult it was to come on Monday mornings, and talk about the weekend and not be able to refer to her partner, because her partner was another woman, or not to be able to put a picture on her desk. So half of her life was being repressed. And yes, half of her ability to deliver, to engage fully in her science, was being repressed. I was not going to say, Thursday morning you're going to come out of the closet, right? No, but I could create the space for her to feel comfortable in coming out. Even today, when many people have done it, it's one of the hardest things for any human being. But it's one of those pieces where you really need to be able to have it out in the open in order to be yourself, to bring all of your energy to life, to bring all of your energy to your creative solutions. Defining values that liberate creativity. One of the most important things that a leader can do is to define, what do you stand for? Do you know what your superiors stand for? Superiors is just a poor choice of word. What your supervisors stand for? Ask them. Because I cannot tell you these are the right values. My values are going to be different. I felt that there were some very important values, some that depended on the nature of the human being. And so I would say, this is what I hold dear. I hold transparency dear. I don't want people having hidden agendas, and I won't have them. Integrity, of course, tops number one. Passion, right? Trust. These are some of my values. Then there are some that talk more about how you interact with each other. Do you respect each other? Do you give each other freedom to be, to speak, to say? Do you work in connection with each other so there's an interdependence, not a dependence, an interdependence. My results depend from my ability of dealing with you, and whatnot and so forth. So it's very important to speak those out clearly so that people know what you as a leader stand for and what the group stands for. Demanding excellence. Enriching lives is part of giving space, because as you give space and people come out with their whole beings, then their lives gets enriched, and then you can celebrate, right? Those differences. And all of that starts creating a culture, but a culture that needs to be reinforced. How do traditional cultures exist, whether it is from Africa or Polynesia? They have oral traditions. Do you know who were the big professors here in the last 40 years? Who were the hot shots? Who wrote the really important papers? Any group should be able to tell you little stories. And how does that happen? Because there are get-togethers where informally there's the sharing of these things. So that's how you create and sustain a culture. And you have places. Every little tribe in Africa has a little place where they all get together at night and they do the drum, 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 drum. Right? So groups should also have that. I used to create things that I called the creativity rooms. They could not be reserved. They would have really comfortable couches. And you could just go in any time to do just shoot the breeze, have lunch, or celebrate a birthday. And then structure a clear organization. I have already talked about that. Who does what with whom? Who's responsible for what? Who makes the decisions on purchasing for a project? Or it's primordial. Is that enough? Is there something missing?
Have fun.
Have fun. Have fun is one of my values. Have fun is definitely one of the values, absolutely. It's part of defining values. Yeah. It's also one of the important characteristics of a leader. And that's what's missing here, guys. A leader that can provide authentic leadership. Most people get enthralled with the idea of, I'm the leader, and now I make the decisions. Ha ha ha, I've got all the power. Now I tell you what to do. If he were that way, you wouldn't dare say it in front of him. So I'm glad you're doing it. So what is authentic leadership? And this is very poignant today with what we're living in this country and the huge vacuum we have of exactly this. Authentic leadership. It's not about self-image or self-aggrandizement. I mean, it's really very tempting to say, I am the big guy. And most people, even people when they get their first person that they supervise, now I'm his boss, I have to say, no, it's not about that. The role of a leader does not exist without a group. So the leader owes the role to the group. And the leader owes himself as a human being to the group as well. leadership, in my experience, and the more I grew and the bigger my responsibilities and the bigger I'm saying not my power but my responsibilities, the most humbling it became. Everything that you say touches somebody quite often in ways that you do not intend. So it is about forgetting your ambitions, forgetting your desire for recognition, or, this is an important one, your desire to be always right. Yes, you as a leader hold your feet to the fire to your people, but they, each one of them, should feel that they can hold your feet to the fire. Your integrity has to be utmost, and it can be questioned by anybody, and will be questioned. You can guarantee that, no question. So then it's not driving towards the accumulation of control or power or personal success, admiration. Leadership is about serving others. You are the base for everything. Everybody stands on you, should. On your shoulders they should grow. So it really should be, true leadership has a new paradigm that most people don't realize. It's not great leaders alone. You cannot be a great leader of nobody. There's no such thing as that. It's great leaders in conjunction with groups, in a fertile relationship with the group. And in that relationship, the leader and the team can achieve things that neither of them can achieve alone. So it is wonderful. It's incredibly demanding. And you really need to be detached to stay calm. But in doing this, the leader finds greatness in the group. And most importantly, and most beautifully of it all, the leader helps the members to find greatness in themselves. A group that has a wonderful leader is a group that is living at their fullest. It's very, very powerful. So I experienced all of this as I grew in responsibilities, and I showed you already what that path looked like, and in demands. When I was sent to France, again, the corporation was saying, we have a lab in France, but the lab had a lot of enemies, and the strategy of the lab was not clear. And the corporation was asking itself, do we need this? Do we need this lab? So I was sent to make the decision, and if so, to define a strategy and to lead them. And it was one of the most powerful leadership experiences that I have had. Of course, it was in a different culture, and I insisted in doing it in their own language, not in English, as most of the American leaders had done. I thought it was disrespectful. But because we were creating a vision that did not exist together. And there had to be a lot of growth from them and from me as a leader to do it. And we did it beautifully, and it was well established and whatever. And I came back to the US thinking, again, life is what happens when you're busy making plans, that I would continue moving along those lines. But to put it in different words, I really should have reminded myself to expect nothing from life but to be prepared and be surprised. And after a year back in the States, I was diagnosed with the most aggressive form of the big C. I had breast cancer. I was not prepared for that one either. And I still remember the phone call, see, and my voice is going to start shaking, when the doctor said, you have cancer. And then when the oncologist said, and it's a very aggressive form, and then it is a triple negative, and then it doesn't have any receptors, and then you only have 18% chance of survival. And I was prepared to keep on running the corporate rat race. And life had to change. I had to devote my energies and to give up all of my roles. And it was a very powerful exercise in really divorcing yourself from the idea that you are your role. See, earlier on I said one has the tendency to think that you are the role that you play, and so you are very important, right? Forget about others. I had a very high chance of not making it, and I made it. So then after a couple of years, I had enough energy, and I just summarized it in a book. I'm not trying to sell it or anything like that. And that's just a way of saying that is the reason I'm not doing what I was doing anymore. But life is still beautiful. So just take it as it comes, and be willing to walk through the doors that it opens. It's worth it. Thank you.
Questions, and I'll let Lina pick people out or moderate if they have a lot of different questions. No? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering how your definition of success might have changed from when you first started out to as you went through these different transitions. So what would you consider, how did it change your definition of career success, personal success?
As I started realizing that I was indeed able to create a culture within my group that in a way extended a little bit beyond, and I started realizing that I could impact people's lives, and I can give you examples of those. It was at the same time kind of, oh shucks, I hope that I'm doing right by them. And it was also very invigorating. So honestly, my definition of success became seeing others being successful. What I said about that new paradigm is really, truly what I have experienced. It is very, very exciting. And I'll give you one example. So I had a scientist, like the one that ended up being the ballroom dancer, who was also always a very fundamental scientist, very interested in just continuing to work by himself. He couldn't care less about other people. And at one point, I could see his interactions with others, and I could see how good of a mentor he was. And I asked him if he would be willing to join an applied project that was already in manufacturing. I mean, to take somebody from fundamental research to manufacturing is, and I explained to him what I wanted him to do. I wanted him to really grow as a mentor and start coaching others and have an influence. And he was very leery at first, but went along, trusted me enough to go along. Today, when he talks about that moment when I changed his life. And when you start realizing that, oh shucks, I can do this, it's a little bit unnerving. But then when you see that you can actually nudge people and allow them to grow and give them a new life, it's very exciting. So yes, it did change because originally it was my personal success. And sure enough, I was a single contributor. So I just depended on myself. So from that standpoint, it was a huge change and a most rewarding one.
You mentioned when you started out how you were not allowed into the program as a woman. You had to really kind of sell yourself. And for me, when I started as a math major in 2001, it was very much an environment where it was still unbalanced, and obviously there was significant progress in that 25 odd years between the mid-70s to 2000, but there's still this attitude of, oh, if you're a girl, you're going to go be a teacher. If you're a boy, you're going to go into industry, which was intensely frustrating for me to deal with. And I feel like since then, over the course of my graduate school and work and back in graduate school, it's been 15 years and I don't feel like anything has changed at all since then. Do you feel like progress is still being made, or?
So there was an interesting article in the New York Times recently talking about the progress of women, and it said that the 80s was the decade when they had made most progress, and the 80s were, you know, my first decade in Corning. And I wish I could say yes, but I'm going to say I don't think so. For some reason, call it, and really here I'm speculating. I'm not a social scientist, you know, or whatever, but for some reason, the gender that had the testosterone in the beginning still has it today, and they could run faster before, and now they're leading everything. And it continues to be. When I went from doing research to leading and doing management and leadership, it was when my abilities were most questioned, even though I could establish myself because my group was the one that was really delivering the goods, right? I was being, oh yes, Lina, you with your touchy-feely thing. Oh yeah, just because women do it differently. Oh, you think that is going to work. But year after year, it was my group that was making right? I was the one that went to marketing. So at one point, the advanced display products was coming to my group saying, we want this glass, and we want this other glass, and we want this other glass. And I saw everybody running in different directions. And I went to marketing and I said, you know, the buck stops here. I'm not going to do any research for you. I know, I might be, but I'm never going to do any research for you until you define what the customer wants. And you go to the Far East and you do it. So I was taking the tough stances, and they did. They went and they talked to the Samsungs and to the Toshibas, and then they came back with a specific set of things. And that was the beginning of the business of advanced display that went from displays were this big back then because the glass could not be made any bigger to what they are now, right? Even though I was proving those, I was still being questioned as, you know, oh, look at that touchy feeling here, oh, liberating the creative, creating a culture. I'm sorry to you guys. I love all of you and I respect all of you, but the system has been rigged. And it's not changing. The number of women that are rising to leadership positions all over the board. Europe has had guidelines to have 30% of women in boards. I haven't even been able to meet them when they have specific guidelines. In the US, there are no guidelines, right? In the US, you cannot even take maternity leave without having to pay a price for it. So no, I don't think it has changed much. Sorry. I wish I had another answer. But it doesn't mean, and we were very active and very women's lib, let's say, more in the 80s than I see my daughter's generation being. And I tell her, you know, you guys feel that you have inherited something that it's more mirage, because we were pushing, we were having meetings with upper management. We were insisting when a woman was passed over, the rest of us would be there. We were pushing and whatever, and I'm sure there was that blip that the New York Times was referring to, and it's gone now. I don't know why.
How did you learn to trust yourself and to be okay with the fluidity of your life instead of going on this linear path that you thought of, to say, okay, this is my plan and it's not happening and I need to be okay with it? How did you become okay with it?
Well, first you learn it the hard way. I had some very painful months, and there were like a couple of 2 years when I was working on diesel particulate filters that were really very painful. I got sustained by swimming every morning. I would get up at 5:15. I would go do an hour of laps, and then I would go to work. My husband would see the kids to school, and then I would come a little earlier than he did. That gave me some balance. My kids gave me a lot of balance, because whenever I came home, that was a different world. So those other pieces balanced me. But I was unhappy enough to say, I'm out of here, I'm going to be looking for a job, knowing fully well that my husband was very happy, and he has had a beautiful career, and now he's at the top of the technical ladder and has all of the freedom, and that I was going to be interfering with that, knowing fully well, but I was at wit's end. It was a very painful moment. So at first it starts like this, right? And then you allow yourself. Now, today I am very comfortable with saying, live the moment. Have the awareness of what you're feeling, so that at least you can kind of look up from above and say, okay, you're upset right now, just relax. As a leader, you really have to do this. When somebody comes in front of you and demands or is really upset and you feel like just going for the jugular, really, George? Oh, well, tell me more about it. That takes a lot of self-control, but at that point, early in my career, I did not have that self-control. I learned it the hard way. Now, I am originally from Colombia, and I come from a culture that is much more expressive than what I was finding in the US. The women that I was finding in Corning were very paused. They really had been coached or something to say things in a very quiet way. Whereas I was really saying the truth as it was, and boy, that did not come, it was not very well accepted. And so that first transition, I also dressed in very bright colors. And you probably have not read the book Dress for Success. Pinstripe suits back then for women with little bows around here instead of ties. There's no way in hell I could wear one of those things. I was very different, so I was used to being very different. Okay, but still, Corning is a very conservative corporate culture. And I was really learning the hard way through a lot of feedback from HR and whatever, that I should learn to express myself very differently. So those were very challenging years. And so little by little, I started thinking, I have to play their game and be myself. Okay? One of the things that I started doing was speaking more slowly, which is more Anglo than Latino. So I would start, and then that would also force me to calm down a little bit. And so I became much more efficient, let's say, or effective, not efficient, but effective in operating in that system. Later on, as I came back from consumer and I started leading a group, I had the wonderful fortune of meeting somebody who was teaching us managers how to give feedback. So in corporate America, there is a process whereby you give feedback to every single one of your employees once a year. Everything is very clearly written. This is what you did. These are your accomplishments. You're wonderful and whatever. But this is how you behaved, and you're a piece of... It's usually the way it goes. And so we were being trained to give feedback, and it's called 360 feedback because you get input from above, from the sides, and from below. Your people that you're, anyhow. So this guy started giving managers this course, and I was required to take it. And he ended up being a wonderful Oriental philosophy guru. He had a PhD in religion from Yale, and he was a professor at Cornell. And this was a wonderful person who opened a whole life to say, just develop some self-awareness of what it is that you're living and how can you make the most out of it. And my life completely changed. It was a huge, huge personal growth. But I had taken my lumps along the way. And I think we all do. I see, my daughter is an equine surgeon. Like me, she's petite. She's a little taller, but and she's very good at what she does. But she also expresses herself forcefully, right? There's no way that I can sit down with her as a mother and say, let me give you a little bit of Oriental philosophy and you can help. She has to learn by herself. And some of these things, you have to learn. It's part of growing up and developing as a human being, as a professional, but also as an evolved soul.
I assume that you continued your career, but what about your husband? So he was originally went to work at home. Did he become like a stay-at-home dad to take care of the kids, or did you continue working?
Oh, I just mentioned it. So among the scientists in Corning and in my group, I particularly allowed them the space to be. There were some of them that really would have nothing to do with management. I mean, some of them wouldn't even attend group meetings. Okay, there were some moments when I insisted that it'd be important. And my husband was the leader of the parade of those. He really didn't want to be a very independent scientist who knew exactly what he did and who always delivered. When he was in my groups, I already said this, he reported to my boss, right? He went on, no, he was not a stay-at-home dad. He was always the soccer coach and the hockey coach. I was, just as active doing some of the mental training for the teams. But no, he went on to have a very successful career, and he's very happy. He's still working. That's the reason we're still living in Corning.
So you talked about leadership styles. You talked about dealing with old white men. Do you have advice for people like us as far as what can be done to address any of the issues that exist?
So I'm going to get into hot water here. I have come to the realization that I have lived in a country that I just really did not know for many years. And probably many of you have come to that realization. Where there are so many people that are so angry because things are being taken away from them that they thought they were entitled to. I mean, I'm talking about Trumpistas, right? And I'm saying, I wonder to what extent many of the people that are well educated, that are liberally minded, that are really not in the Trumpista camp but in others, have felt a little bit of that, right? And the only way to get around that is to say, open up, right? It is not that somebody is taking away your lunch, right? Whether you're a Trumpista or you're not. It is about saying, okay, what do these people bring to my life experience? One of you faculty was telling me, should I help coach the people that come from different cultures? And how do I do that? Right? And sometimes we don't know what those people are thinking. So we women simply want to have an opportunity. Minorities want exactly the same thing. We don't want to be given the fast-paced lane, right? So I'm just saying, have the curiosity. And perhaps you do. Okay? And if you do and you're perfectly okay and everything is okay, take a step forward and share that. I think among any group, and I was telling the students that if you're not part of the solution, if you're not bringing a little piece that says, well, this could be done that way, and you accept the status quo, you're part of that. You're part of the precipitate, right? Okay. So bring in and move the ball, playing the team that is taking the ball to the goal. Does that make sense?
I think so.
And I apologize if I insult anybody by comparing all white men to Trumpistas, because that is not the case. But I was just making because it's like all of a sudden I'm waking up and saying, where have I lived? I thought this was a different country. I mean, all of this resentment, where has it been? It has been there, right?
I want to follow up on that and also return to one of the kind of tasks that you, or not tasks, but I guess characteristics of successful leadership, and that is to liberate your team to be who they are. And you give us the example of your coworker who had to hide half of her life from the rest of her colleagues. But you also mentioned working within a very conservative company, and all of us, regardless of what, apparently live in a kind of terrifying country. So
Right.
how do you balance that, your own openness and your desire to want to liberate people? How do you balance that with the fact that once they're liberated, they might be discriminated against or be punished for that by that larger world, which is actually quite unpleasant in many ways?
So the fundamental key, which is the one that I gave you in response to what you brought up, the fundamental key is, as you are helping people liberate themselves, open up. Actually, what you're doing is creating the space for them open up, right? You are hopefully using one of the most powerful tools there is. It is the one that allows them to develop self-awareness. Okay? What is self-awareness? It's really the ability to know what it is that you feel and think at any given moment. Okay? It's not the ability to remain calm. You can do that. Well, that's pretty good. It's not the ability to remain calm. It's the ability to see what you're going through. Right? So it's a quintessential tool in conflict management. Yeah. Most bullies are bullies because they feel really poorly about themselves, right? And so in putting somebody else down, they feel good, right? So if you help them have the awareness of what it is that is driving them, then they can understand, okay, I'm feeling this right now, right? If Weinstein knew what he was doing every time he was citing somebody, then he might have been able to stop himself, right? So with any kind of behavior. So if help people to grow, and this is not easy to do, and you have to be skilled and you have to be well short and whatever. But if you do this, that ability to have self-awareness can be used in anything. Right? So if they are feeling discriminated, then they can understand what they're feeling, and by understanding, either control their behavior, if their behavior is helping cause that, or figure out a reaction that is appropriate.
But in your coworker's case, or in your there is no action that's appropriate. It's the system that's inappropriate, right?
Yes, it is the system. No, let's put it this way. It is the culture that is constraining.
Yeah.
Yes. And
it's not about self-awareness necessarily. It's about being so self-aware that you know that you will be punished if you say so.
Well, I mean, you're saying being punished, right?
Well, not in your group.
Yeah, no. But being punished for the behavior, being chastised for the behavior, is that?
Or like being passed up for promotions or being in other ways, right?
Well,
and it doesn't, right?
To be passed up for a promotion because of behavior, is that what you're saying? That is
well, in this particular example that you gave, it was about sexual orientation, but there could be plenty of other kinds of, thoughts or feelings or
yeah.
aspects of someone's life that could lead them to be discriminated
Yeah,
against.
yeah, and honestly, there was a lot of fear in the GLBT community when they started coming out. And one of the things that we did, which I orchestrated, is we would take the top leadership, starting at the very top with the CEO and the operating committee, and we would have dinners with one top management and 60 LBTs, people, 4 or 5 or 6, and educate them. I mean, we would even ask them to say the words gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, because they were so uncomfortable they couldn't even pronounce them. You know, and so yes, all of these people were afraid and were taking a risk, but they were aware of that. Could I guarantee that in the future nobody would discriminate against them because they were gay? No, I could not. All right, and to be honest. So the guy that I have used as an example whose results often were fed from the results of others, and then he would come up and create it. He was not in my group, but at one moment he played with my group. And he got results that were being generated by my group, and he went out and he wrote an invention disclosure. And an invention disclosure is a very important document because that's where patents come from. And then people in my group came to me, and they knew that I would go to bat for them. So I went to my boss, and I said, this is happening with X, Y, and Z. So it so happened that X, Y, and Z was one of the favorites of my boss. And he had been given free rein to do whatever he wanted because he always delivered results. So he had been made into an untouchable, all right? And he said, well, you have to make sure that you don't destroy him. And I said, no, I'm not going to destroy him, but I'm going to make sure that he learns where the buck stops and that he has to learn to behave with integrity. And it's not just my view, it's the law. In a patent, you can only have the names of the people who are real contributors, not the ones that assemble data from others, right? And I took him to task. And I went to the patent department, and we went, it was the most painful process, lab book by lab book, date by date, who wrote what first. And we demonstrated that everything that he had post-dated, every single invention, and he was out of the patent. I'm not in the lab anymore, and I have not been in the lab anymore. He was recently suspended for 6 months for the exact same behavior. Why? Because there was nobody there to stop him. Right? So yes, when you turn around, when you turn back, things may change. Is it frustrating? Of course it is. Yeah. But what do you have to do? Realize that it's not your role anymore. So yes, you're taking some risks, but I think if you're transparent and you have integrity and people know what you're doing and people understand the risks, they will also rise to the occasion and be willing to take it on their own. So it's not about having a life that is perfectly protected. Yes, when you're the boss, the kind of boss that I love to be, I was there going to bat for them. And they know it, and I would protect them, and I would tell them, okay, you can expect from me to always protect your careers, to be your PR agent, to let people know how good you are, and a series of things. And then I expect from you, and then I would give them that. And then when you're gone, you're gone. And sure, when I went to France, I would hear horror stories from the people that I left in the US. And the culture survives. And if you have established it high enough, if I had ended up being the CTO, if my cancer hadn't hit me, perhaps many a group would have a similar culture. But it's life, constantly evolves.
I think we should maybe take the conversation up to the Geology Lounge.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder, please join us up on the 4th floor of Geology for our cheese and wine reception. Thank you so much.